Yeah, actually, I think the description he gives of. I also think that could be. What do you think is the title for the episode? Is Gatsby black and is Nick gay? No, but yeah, I think the description he gives of Tom is actually like a sick burn. He basically says that he's an asshat who like peaked at 21,
Right.
and that's like the first and only description you like get of Tom.
Right.
But the description he gives of Gatsby by comparison is, I don't know, his relationship with Gatsby is complicated, so and that makes our relationship with Gatsby complicated too. He doesn't quite trust him. He thinks he's a little bit deceitful and conniving because he lies to him at first about what he does for a living and where he grew up and what his family, like what kind of family he's from. But at the same time, he also thinks of him as handsome and charming.
Right. I think, I mean, right from the jump of this story, you pretty much know that Nick is probably an extremely unreliable narrator. Maybe one of the most, like, in literary history. And because, like, in that first paragraph where Nick is just talking and the whole thing starts with all the people in the world haven't had the advantages you've had and things like that, he says, in consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgments, and then spends the next 120 pages judging people. He also says, a sense of the fundamental decencies is parceled out unequally at birth. And, I mean, besides being, like, really tough language to understand, he's basically saying that, like, not everybody is born the same. Some people are born just kind of like they don't fit well with people. And he says that he goes west. He's sick of being at school, and that he wanted no more riotous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. And finally, he says, Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn for. Like, he points out right at the beginning, he doesn't like the rich, he doesn't like the people who are, like, lavish, he doesn't want to be involved with people and money, so the reason he moves to New York is to start working after he finishes school at, like, a low-key firm and just kind of do his little work, live in his little house, and then just gets immediately wrapped up in this huge, like, lifestyle where his neighbors are crazy and they're having parties and, like, money and using people rather than, like, seeing them as people.
He does, yeah. And I think Fitzgerald is writing about like his own conflicted relationship with like wealth and excess at that point. Um, but yeah, he does say that.
Yeah, I mean, you see that too. Like when we were talking about him going to drink with Tom and Myrtle, he says like, "Oh, I've only been drunk twice in my life, and the second time was that afternoon." And then, damn near like every other day that this book takes place, he's like having champagne with Gatsby, or having whiskey with Tom, and like all he does is drink. Anytime he's
That's
like,
all of them do.
which is true, and I mean, like I said, he likes. I feel like the narrator. You really get a clear picture that the narrator is a character, not just like a camera lens.
He is,
and that the narrator specifically is a complete liar. Like he's one of these people that likes to think like, oh, I came from wealth, but I'm different. I'm not the judgy type. I don't want to be a part of any of that. And then just immediately gets back into it.
He does come off as somewhat judgmental about these people, but it's hard to think of anyone who wouldn't be judgmental of these people. I think he does a good job of at least keeping his judgments to himself and the reader.
Kind of. I think this is a book that, I mean, obviously the first thing you notice is the prose, and it's beautiful. I think there's a lot of things hidden in that prose. Like, we talked about, like, that weird encounter with Mr. McKee, and I feel like there's lots of little things hidden in there. At one point, toward the beginning, there's a little mention that Nick had a girl who was possibly going to be his wife. He might have been engaged to her, and then he just moved away. And he remarks that he has to like, oh, I've got to call her and like tell her what happened, saying that like he pretty much just like got up and ran off from a girl he was with.
Right.
Like it really cements that like I guess one, this narrator is definitely a part of this world, and two, that there's nobody really good in this book. Like I would say that every one of these characters, like, pretty much, I mean, I guess you could look at some little things, but for the most part, they don't have anything good in them. Like, there's certain things that are admirable, like Gatsby, like, he doesn't use his money necessarily for evil, but he's certainly wasting it away to just try to get something shallow.
Yeah.
Like, Tom and Daisy are just awful people who don't care about anything. Jordan is the same way. Nick is pretty much, for the most part, doesn't care about people. Like, I feel like the main thing that you see in all of these characters is just a complete, like, lack of humanity. They almost come across as sociopaths. Like, between the murders that happen, like, later in the book, and, like, there just doesn't seem to be any humanity in these characters.
Yeah, I mean, they do come across as careless.
I mean, like, toward the end, which we'll probably get to in a bit, but after the whole thing with Myrtle happens, Tom eventually pretty much orders the killing of Gatsby by telling, I don't remember the name of the mechanic, George, that that it was Gatsby's car. After that, Nick sees him on the street one day, and Tom pretty much just says, like, oh, Gatsby fooled you, just like Daisy, and then moves on.
Yeah.
Like, absolutely no remorse or anything. Doesn't care that his, like, long-term girlfriend died. Doesn't care that, like...
Well, he talks about how he cried like a baby when he, like, went back to that apartment
That's
and
what
had
he
to
says.
enter. That's what he says, yeah. I don't know.
Yeah. It's just very clear that none of the... I mean, and it's one of the most, like, famous lines in the book that the whole... They were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and...
retreated back into their money or vast carelessness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's, like... I feel like that, more than anything, describes these characters. They're just careless. One of my favorite parts that I really picked up this read, too, was when Nick is driving with Jordan. At one point, he says, "You're a rotten driver. You ought to be more careful." And she says, "I am careful." And he says, "No, you're not." And she says, "Well, other people are." He replies, "What's that got to do with it?" And she says, "They'll keep out of my way." And he says, "Suppose you meet someone as careless as yourself." And she says, "I hope I never will. I hate careless people." And it's just beautiful, beautiful hypocrisy. Like, she accepts that she's awful. She accepts that she doesn't care about people. She doesn't, like, certainly not while driving or doing anything in her life. And even when, like, completely faced with it and is like, you are doing, like, an awful job. You don't care about these people. She just goes, "Nah, I don't. Like, I don't really care about the people." And I think Nick kind of reacts to that in a strange way of like, oh man, what am I doing with this girl? But he's exactly the same way.
Yeah.
And I think she even comments like on it way later in the book when he basically calls to break up with her. And yeah, he's exactly the same kind of person.
That's what she tells him, yeah, that he's a careless driver.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that it's not... I guess it goes back to... Nick likes to think he's not this scumbag, but he's just as bad as everyone else.
So this book, along with The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, are cited as the American novels, like the great American novels.
I guess I could see that.
And for an American novel, this book, it's not about democracy, it's not about freedom.
No.
It's not about...
I mean, you could maybe freedom through money.
See, I don't even think of like that. Like you could make that argument. It's not about equality. It's about like de facto American aristocracy, inequality, and the limitations of like American social mobility.
Yeah, I guess that's true. I mean, I think that's kind of the point. Is that the book really strongly ties all of these careless, awful, like sociopathic characters to money. And I think that's kind of the message you get from this book, is that the people with money, the people who mostly you're concerned with, they can afford to be careless because nothing they do matters. But the people that you see that don't have money, people like George and all the different people who live in like the Valley of Ashes, they actually have to deal with the consequences. And you see that even in just like the setting of the Valley of Ashes. The ashes are there because of their byproducts of all the industry.
Industrial revolution.
Right.
Yeah.
And they're basically suffering and choking in these conditions because the people in Manhattan and the people in Long Island need fancy buildings and fancy houses. And so every time they drive through there or they take the train through the Valley of Ashes, it's always just a dark, sad scene of like Nobody wants to be there. And then in between, like, the beautiful, like, colorful places like Manhattan and all the homes and the parties, there's just this sad gray part in the middle. And yeah, I think that's the point, that this, to have such lavish lifestyles, to have these crazy houses and to have these parties and to not care about people, it does cost. None of the characters think it costs anything. Of like, oh, I mean, I'm just having parties, no one's being hurt. But there's constantly people being hurt. And they're so careless they don't even see that.
Right. Yeah.